This is lecture number 34 in the series The ABCs of Communism on YouTube, and it's based on chapter 51 in your next year's edition of the textbook The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2016, which is entitled Empire Strikes Back Against Costa Rica. And because we didn't cover Costa Rica in the first go-around on the Latin American countries, part one of this lecture deals with that background. So let me just point out that Costa Rica as a name, which in English means rich coast, was originally given to what is now the Republic of Costa Rica by Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, when he visited that coast in 1502. It borders on Nicaragua to the north and Panama to the south. Now, because it has islands, it also borders on Colombia on the Atlantic side and Ecuador on the Pacific side. It has a population around 4.5 million, most of whom live in, a quarter at least, live in the city of San Jose, which is the capital and the largest city. In terms of its physical geography, it's located on the Central American Isthmus. In the next lecture on Panama, I'm going to talk more about the peculiar tectonic history of that isthmus, but we don't need to go into it right now, but you know that that is the narrowest part of the connection between Middle America and South America, and that it has been for a long time the major place upon which people would cross if they wanted to cut down the distance between North America and South America, or Europe and South America. And it lies between 8 degree north latitude and 82 degrees south longitude. It borders the Caribbean Sea to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west, as we've seen, and has 800 miles of coastline, 132 miles of which are on the Caribbean coast, and 631 miles on the Pacific coast. Now, as I say, it borders Nicaragua to the north and has 192 miles of border with Nicaragua, and Panama to the south with 210 miles of border to that country. In total, Costa Rica has 51,100 square kilometers, or 19,700 square miles of land area, and 589 square miles, kilometers, and 237 square miles of territorial waters. Costa Rica has several islands. Cocos Island is one of the biggest at 93 square miles, and it stands out because of its distance from the continental landmass, which is 300 miles away from Punta Arenas. Calero Island is the largest island of the country with 151.6 square kilometers, or 58.5 square miles. Over 25% of Costa Rica's national territory is protected by CNOC, the National System of Conservation Areas, which oversees all of the country's protected areas. Costa Rica also possesses the greatest density of species in the world. Now, in terms of its tectonic features, the highest point in the country is Cerro Chirripó at 12,530 feet. It is the fifth highest peak in Central America. The highest volcano in the country is the Iracil volcano at 11,257 feet, and the largest lake is Lake Arenal. There are 14 known volcanoes in Costa Rica, and 6 of them have been very active in the last 75 years. The country has also experienced at least 10 earthquakes of magnitude 5.7 or higher, 3 of which are magnitude 7 or higher in the last 100 years. Now, as for its climate, Costa Rica is located between 8 and 12 degrees north of the equator, so the climate is tropical year-round. However, the country has many microclimates depending upon the elevation, rainfall, topography, and by the geography of each particular region. Costa Rica's seasons are dependent on how much rain falls during a particular period. The year consists of 2 periods. The dry season is in the summer, and the rainy season, known locally as winter. The summer or dry season goes from December to April, which is the last time I was there, about 10 years ago. I was there in April, and found the weather to be really nice, especially since I just left Des Moines, Iowa, where we still had snow and ice on the ground. And the rainy season goes from May to November. This winter season coincides with the Atlantic hurricane season, and during this time it rains constantly in some regions. Receiving the most rain are the Caribbean slopes of the Central Cordillera Mountains, with an annual rainfall of over 197 inches. Humidity is also higher on the Caribbean side than on the Pacific side. The mean annual temperature on the coastal lowlands is around 81 degrees Fahrenheit, down to as low as 68 degrees Fahrenheit in the main populated areas of the Central Cordillera, such as San Jose, and below 50 degrees on the summits of the highest mountains. Costa Rica is home to a rich variety of plants and animals. While the country has only about 0.1% of the world's landmass, it contains 5% of the world's biodiversity. Around 25% of the country's land area is protected in national parks. Thus, Costa Rica has the largest percentage of nationally protected area in the world. Costa Rica has also successfully managed to diminish deforestation to nearly zero. The Corcovado National Park is internationally renowned among ecologists for its biodiversity, including big cats and tapirs, where visitors can expect to see an abundance of wildlife. Corcovado is the one park in Costa Rica where all 4 Costa Rican monkey species are located. These include the white-headed capuchin, the mantler howler, the endangered deaf-freeze spider monkey, and the Central American squirrel monkey. The latter are found only on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica and a small part of Panama, and are considered endangered or vulnerable because of deforestation and illegal pet selling and illegal hunting. At any rate, Tortuguero National Park, that is, Tortuguero is the Spanish word for meaning full of turtles. It is home to spiders, howlers, and white-throated capuchin monkeys, 3-toed and 2-toed sloths, as well as 320 species of birds and a variety of reptiles. The park is the annual most important nesting place for the endangered green turtle. The giant leatherback, hawksbill, and loggerhead turtles also nest there. The Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve is home to about 2,000 plant species, including numerous orchids. Over 400 types of birds and more than 100 species of mammals live there. Over 840 species of birds inhabit Costa Rica. As is the case in much of Central America, the avian species in Costa Rica are a mix of North and South American species. The country's abundant fruit trees, many of which bear fruit year-round, are hugely important to these birds, some of whom survive on diets that consist only of 1 or 2 types of fruit. Some of the country's most notable avian species include the resplendent quetzal, scarlet macaw, 3-wattled bellbird, bare-necked umbrella bird, and the keel-billed toucan. The National Institute of Biodiversity is allowed to collect royalties on any biological discoveries of medical importance. Costa Rica is also the center of biological diversity for reptiles and amphibians, including the world's fastest-running lizard, the spiny-tailed iguana. There's an interesting article in the August 25th edition, 2015, of Science magazine, which goes into some details about the nature of the orchids and their dazzling diversity. This author follows up a fellow named Eric Stokstad on Darwin's long interest in orchid species. In fact, Darwin had followed up his Origin of the Species with a treatise on the pollination of orchids. And he points out that Darwin had marveled at the diversity of these plants, and he saw the myriad ways in which the flowers and pollinating insects have adapted to each other as an extended case study in natural selection. The contrivances for fertilization in orchids are multiform and truly wonderful and beautiful, Darwin wrote to a horticulturalist who had sent him specimens. Well, anyway, evolutionary biologists never lost their fascination with orchids. With more than 25,000 species, they're the biggest group within the plant kingdom, comprising roughly 8% of all vascular plant species. Now, just to cut to the chase on this particular study, they managed to do a DNA study on the chloroplast genes in these orchids. And what the summary of what they were able to discover is that about 112 million years ago, the first orchids appeared. And then by 90 million years ago, the major living lineages started to split from each other. And just before 64 million years ago, a key lineage started to split off of that, and it had developed a way of putting pollen on pollinators, such as a bee or an insect or a bird or whatever, in the form of large sticky balls called pollinia, so that pollinators would not lose any grains before reaching other orchids. Now, as flowers evolved intricate structures to attach pollinia, some orchids stick them smack between the eyes of their favorite insect species, for instance. Reproductive barriers likely formed, giving birth to new species. Indeed, in lineages that have pollinia, the speciation rate was 5% higher than in lineages that don't. Well, and as it turns out, that by 35 million years ago, many orchids have become epiphytes, that is, a plant that clings to trees and then gets its moisture from the atmosphere. And this further allowed them to move into different kinds of environments along with the trees that they were attaching themselves to, and that also greatly boosted their speciation rate. I'm not going to go through the details of that. If you're interested, as I say, go to Science Magazine. You can read the article there in the August 25th edition this year. Now, let's move on from the natural history of Costa Rica to its historical overview. Indigenous people of the primitive communist hunting, gathering, and tribal agricultural varieties originally inhabited the area we know as Costa Rica. This Costa Rican area then entered the chiefdom levels of sociocultural evolution, and eventually they came into the servitude epoch, also autochthonously. After the conquest of Peru by the Spanish Ronin that began in 1532, the entire area of what is now Costa Rica and Panama was part of Spain's Panama colony. Panama had come under direct rule from Madrid as soon as the Pizarro brothers and their group of Ronin adventurers reported that Peruvian natives had silver in 1528. Thereafter, the Panama Canal colony remained the most important colony of the Spanish Empire until the final collapse of the Bourbon and Napoleonic regimes in Madrid, finalized in 1815. Independence then came to Costa Rica as part of the short-lived First Mexican Empire that emerged from the native Creole breakaway of Mexico. This polity was followed by membership in the United Provinces of Central America. In turn, with the dissolution of the United Provinces, it declared its own sovereignty in 1847. So from 1847 until the Civil War victory of Jose Figueres in 1849, Costa Rica had been one of the two most stable, prosperous, and progressive nations of Central America. The other is modern Nicaragua, which, however, took until 1979 to win its freedom from the U.S.-imposed Somoza dictatorship. Costa Rica's immunity from U.S. imperialism was due to the abolition of a standing army and secret police by Jose Figueres that left the gringos nothing to buy off. Costa Rica has consistently performed favorably in the Human Development Index, placing 62nd in the world as of 2012, and among the highest of any Latin American nations. It also has been credited by the United Nations Development Program for the same. Its rapidly developing economy, once heavily dependent on agriculture, has diversified to include sectors such as finance, pharmaceuticals, and ecotourism. Costa Rica is known for its progressive environmental policies, being only one of two countries to meet all 5 criteria established to measure environmental sustainability, the other being Cuba. Costa Rica was ranked 5th in the world and 1st in the Americas in the 2012 Environmental Performance Index. Now that Cuba has gained more access to these indexing operations, I suspect that that is going to begin, they're beginning to show themselves there as well. There's an outfit called New Economics Foundation, which maintains what it calls a Happy Planet Index It hasn't really been measuring Cuba, as most of them haven't been because of the U.S. embargo on Cuba. But now with the new détente between Washington and Havana, we could expect to see all of that coming to a change. Now, that's an overall view of the history of Costa Rica. Let's go back and take a more detailed view of primitive communism in Costa Rica. As an archaeologist, you know that I have divided the pre-Columbian history of the New World and Middle America as follows. First, a lithic stage, then a proto-archaic stage, thirdly, an archaic stage, fourthly, the formative tribal agricultural stage, fifthly, the formative simple chiefdom stage, then the pre-classic period of advanced theocratic chiefdoms, which runs from roughly 3000 BC to 250 BC, the classic period of the early slave stage, or 250 to 900 AD, and the post-classic from 900 to 1500 AD, and is the later slave stage. And then we have the arrival of the Spanish Ronin and the feudal stage. Now, that's the overview of its prehistory. Let's take a little bit closer look at the archaeological evidence there. For the lithic stage, we know that the oldest archaeological evidence currently in Costa Rica are stone tools dating 12,000 to 9,000 years ago in the Turrialba Valley at the archaeological sites called Guarderia and Florence. There have been uncovered stone matching quarries and workshops in these same areas. These are the advanced lithic autochthonous cultures. It is unclear as to whether these dates are associated with basally fluted projectile points, but they probably are. As such, they would be part of the autochthonously evolved advanced lithic originating in the U.S. Southwest. There are also leaf-shaped points which reflect a northward movement from the Venezuelan origin area of advanced lithic hunting and gathering cultures. And we have discussed these autochthonously evolved advanced lithic cultures of the New World before, and one can reference the original study I published in John Erickson's book, Peopling of the New World. Basally fluted projectile points and Lerma leaf-shaped projectile points reflect the intersection of both technologies from those two New World centers, which evolved from a much earlier migration into the New World, and were probably carried by direct contact or actual migration of peoples carrying the Lerma and fluted point advanced lithic autochthonous advanced lithic culture into Costa Rica. We might suggest the possibility that in this area two different cultures coexisted. The peoples of this area were at least semi-sedentary. They moved in bands of about 20 to 30 people. Their usual prey were animals called megafauna, such as giant armadillos, giant sloths, and mastodons, and these became extinct by 8,000 years before our time. The first settlers had to adapt to hunting smaller animals, therefore, and develop appropriate strategies to adjust to the new conditions. However, now that we have dates of at least 55,000 years in Brazil, this means that their forerunners would have had to pass through Costa Rica in order to get to South America. It is clear that much more archaeological research is in order in Costa Rica to see if we can't uncover the traces of those early passers through. These first settlers of Costa Rica belonged to small nomadic groups of around 20 to 30 people, so it won't be easy to find those early settlements, but we do know that they were bound by kinship and that they moved continually to hunt animals, gather roots and wild plants. In addition to the animal species that still exist today, their usual prey would have included the megafauna of giant armadillos, giant sloths, and mastodons that we just mentioned, and they may well have continued coastal hopping along both the Pacific and Atlantic sides of northern South America. This would account for the early dates in Chile and Peru on the one side and Brazil on the other, providing further support to the thesis of island hopping from Northeast Asia to Northwest America as one route of entry of the first Americans. The Proto-Archaic stage begins by when the climate changes around 10,500 years ago. Now, the increase in temperature caused substantial changes in vegetation and saw the extinction of the megafauna. The hunter-gatherers adapted to these new conditions by continuing hunting of smaller species, such as tapirs, the collared peccary, and deer, as they had been doing before, and exploiting a broad spectrum of tropical vegetation. So the Proto-Archaic there is definitely a period of broad spectrum, wild resource exploiting, hunting and gathering bands, ranging now in size from about 30 to 100 people. Their increasing knowledge of the local environments allowed them to plan their travels through different areas based on the periodic ripening of certain fruits and the growth of familiar plants. This growth in knowledge accounts for the internal causation or preparation as the eventual basis of agriculture. It is not just the further exploitation of available resources. It was both. Now, along the way, they would not only use temporary shelter under rock ledges or establish outdoor camps with tapavientos, that is Spanish for windbreaker walls based on the cypressillo tree, but learn how to build other temporary structures as well. Temporary structures, of course, prepare the way for semi-permanent and eventually permanent structures. Now, from this, the archaic stage evolved, where we see tradesmen work areas, campfire pits, and other fragmentary evidence of life in these groups. And in the Turrialba Valley, much of this abounds in and around the site of Guanacaste. The manufacturing of specialized tools for various activities, such as scrapers, knives, and spear tips, exhibit differences in form and size comparable to the earlier stone tools of the megafauna hunters. There are now, in addition, tools utilized in wild resource collection as a staple in the inventory of productive arts. Now, with regard to the agricultural revolution, agriculture is evidenced archaeologically in the site's remains of populations that lived in Costa Rica by 5,000 years ago. They mainly grew tubers and roots like carrots. The first and second millennium BC feature settled farming communities, where the earliest use of pottery so far known in Costa Rica appears around 2000 to 3000 BC. The evidence comes in the form of shards of pots, cylindrical vases, platters, gourds, and other forms of vases decorated with grooves, prints, and some modeled after animals. This is followed by the formative tribal agricultural stage. Now, Professor McNeish and I discussed many times the probability that even though Tehuacan is the center for Mexican and other Mesoamerican domestication of corn and other edibles, that this does not mean that it was the only such center, and that all subsequent Mesoamerican corn domestication flows exclusively from there. He was searching the mountains of Belize for such evidence of contemporaneity when he was killed a few years ago. Now, we know that there was widespread experimentation with domestication in North America and South America, contemporaneous with that in Mesoamerica. And for that matter, much the same is true with regard to Old World domestication that was occurring simultaneously with a variety of plants and animals throughout Eurasia. Karl Marx had provided the theoretical clarification for this process with his discovery of the universality of the laws of history. In other words, this is exactly what should have happened in history. Either by contact with the Tehuacan inventory, or by contemporary experimentation and domestication, or both, by 7000 BP, that is years ago, it became common in Costa Rica to farm tubers and corn, as well as to cultivate fruit trees and palm trees. Agriculture emerged inevitably from the earlier acquired knowledge of the animal cycles of the broad spectrum of familiar plants. Annual cycles, I should say. This development occurred over thousands of years and coexisted with traditional hunting and gathering, one affording stability for the ascension of the other. To ensure successful subsistence of these groups, there had to exist forms of collective work and property, as well as egalitarian relationships. Proper social organization for each step in socio-cultural evolution has to accompany every advance in people's technology. Now, in the beginning, the social organization of these hunting, gathering, and early agricultural groups was that of primitive communism, or in a word, egalitarian. People would have lived in band and tribal societies organized by kinship. All such societies feature egalitarian relationships between individuals and organizations in clans or groups whose members consider themselves to be descended from a common ancestry. Such ties, along with cross-kinship cutting organizations called sodalities, serve as the only foundation for the economic and social organizational relations, and we've discussed all of this in previous lectures. Leadership was informal, based on age and respect. Ownership of most goods, other than the highly personal, would have been collective. Transition to class and state society begins when tribal councils were well suited to manage food production and distribution, mediate disputes, and dole out justice. The only professional specialists then were part-time shamans who provided continuity in ideological life and what primitive medicine has existed. Environmental stress created social stress, and both required the advent of surplus on hand to mediate such stress. The organization of society to provide for both the continuity of the organizing principle of primitive communism, that is, produce only what is needed day to day to avoid setting up centrifugal forces of envy, jealousy, and coveting, and at the same time acquire the needed surpluses for rainy days. As the time went on, such surpluses could have supported one or two full-time specialists. This is we've discussed before, the general crisis of tribal agriculture. This new survival strategy required a new stage in human socio-cultural evolution, and the resolution of the general crisis of tribal agriculture gives us the stage of simple chiefdoms. Now, the simple chiefdom stage in Costa Rica happened when organized agriculture meant sedentary life for sowing of crops and irrigation. Sedentarism ensured the improvement of productive techniques on farmlands, soil depletion, and the consequent necessity to rotate crops, as well as a steady increase in the population made it possible to expand a group's size, and in turn, expanding size meant increasing need to produce more food more efficiently. This is an elaboration of the general crisis of tribal agriculture, and it can only be resolved via better central planning of production and the storage of what is in excess of each farm's needs. Such needs based upon a communally agreed upon amount needed for each person in each farm. What is produced beyond that is collected and sent to the social center, the chief and her consigliere, in other words. Now, between 300 BC and 300 AD, tribal agricultural societies in Costa Rica moved from a tribal kinship-based organization to simple chiefdom stage organization, with chiefs and consigliere, full-time religious specialists, evolved from shamans, as did professional specialists. These chiefdom groups established territorial divisions that were more strongly demarcated than those in tribal times. Simple chiefdoms were able to expand their geographical spheres to produce more food and control expanding sources of raw materials such as forests and rock quarries. These groups also developed trading networks with other communities and regions. The formative simple chiefdom stage therefore emerges, and between 2000 BC and 300 BC, some communities of early farmers evolved in the form of their egalitarian societies. This was the intermediary period between primitive communism and the servitude epoch. The development of agriculture prompted changes in the relationship between humans and nature and allowed them to feed many more people. Furthermore, the ever-growing dependence on agriculture compelled human groups to establish permanent settlements around agricultural fields. This led to stable villages of huts that had to be erected in clear areas of forest. The agricultural system most likely employed was slash and burn. The forest would be cut with stone axes and spades, then burned to prepare it for planting crops. Agricultural practices included living plant community encouragement, and at the same time experimentation with seed collecting and selecting. The cultivation of plants on stakes led inevitably to the farming of tubers such as yuccas, yams, sweet potatoes, and diverse plums and trees such as avocados and nuances. Alongside, hunting and fishing occurred. This activity was very stable since it demanded few nutrients from the soil, rarely caused erosion, and could be developed in hilly areas. By such means, societies would eventually evolve true agriculture in Costa Rica. The cultivation of plants from seeds would have had a greater effect on the environment when it began because it required more nutrients from the soil and caused greater erosion. This system had a big advantage in that it made food easier to store, so they could be made available all year, not just around harvest time. However, one concomitant would have been larger societies. To maintain such larger societies, some professionalization of labor would eventually be seen as helpful. The centralization of authority beyond the tribal council toward a central administration by a chief would eventually be an easily visualized alternative. The production of corn, as well as associated plants such as beans and ayotes, which are a kind of a gourd related to the pumpkin, could be arranged more efficiently this way. Between 2000 and 1000 BC, there was a 1,000-year period, a millennium in Costa Rica, when people lived in small, sedentary agricultural communities. They used pottery bowls and some ceramic utensils, as well as tools made from wood, bone, and ground and polished stone for agricultural land preparation and food preparation. Reliance upon effective social administration for limited professional specialization was natural. The oldest of such agricultural village communities has been found in the province of Guanacaste between 2000 and 500 BC. More recent ones, between 1500 and 300 BC, have been discovered in the Turrialba Valley, the coastal region of Guandoca, the northern plains of Costa Rica, Sarapiquí Basin, Barva, Herradura, the Paraba River Basin, the Coto Colorado River Basin, and Isla del Caño. Now, advanced theocratic chiefdoms eventually emerged in Costa Rica as more simple chiefdoms grew and became advanced centers of economic, political, and religious power. The appearance of these types of chiefdoms also led to ranked hierarchies, with village ranking as well into principal villages and secondary towns. From around 300 BC, there began to appear large villages with infrastructural works of various importance, foundations, roads, burial mounds, that indicate a certain centralization of authority and managerial capacity to mobilize communities for construction tasks. Ethnographic social ranking of societies at this level features a primary chief in the dominant village and as well secondary chiefs in subordinate villages. In Costa Rica, the principal archaeological sites of this period include the diverse housing sites of the Nicoya Peninsula. There are also housing structures of this stage at the sites of Severo Ledesma and Las Mercedes. On the Atlantic side, there are contemporaneous settlement ruins in the Valle del General, as well as the Coto Bruce, the Coto Colorado, and the Taraba River basins. Several megalith types of archaeological sites are found in Guanacaste province, and they are of this same period. In particular are tombs covered in tons of stone. In other sites in the Costa Rican Central Valley and along the Pacific, archaeologists have uncovered housing plots delimited with rounded edges, mounds, clay floors, and roads. In the South Pacific region are the famous stone spheres of Costa Rica. Their purpose is still unclear, but a working hypothesis is that these stone spheres are religiously blessed symbols of social rank and or as territorial markers. Religious blessing may have had an astronomical function associated with cycles of agriculture. At any rate, eventually the Olmec religion arrived. There was a great development in the manufacture of objects made of jadeite, or so-called social jade, meaning green or off-white stones such as quartz, chalcedony, opal, and serpentine. I first encountered these in my excavations of this kind of rock in northern British Columbia, where it was worked into various kinds of adzes. Such tools are used in woodworking and as personal ornaments. Costa Rican jade working began around 500 BC. Mayan artisanship and Olmec glyphs proved the arrival of the Olmec religion by AD 700. From this period, burials demonstrate the existence of both rank and class. Further research should show a temporal sequence of ranks becoming classes. Burial offerings include artifacts made of jade and other green gemstones, ceremonial grinding stones, scepter stones, and elaborate ceramics. The number, quality, and difficulty of obtaining these articles indicated the person's social rank and/or class. Eventually, these advanced theocratic chiefdoms, or ATCs, entered the slave stage. From AD 300 to AD 800, advanced theocratic chiefdoms, ATC societies, developed into class-divided and state-organized kingdoms. The state, that is professional army and police specialists, evolved in the ATCs from the groups of armed men initially used to protect trade and perhaps occasionally to ensure obedience of the chief's agricultural projects. Also, if the need arose, to justify the use of these semi-professional specialists as warriors in defense. Social order required that such professional specialists be paid. Once this happens to armed men, their existence, however justified, the instrument was at hand to ensure that the mass of farmers did as they were told. Remember that egalitarian beliefs had already been steadily eroded over the previous centuries. Now ATC religious practices, specialists I should say, priests and priestesses would have advocated some sadistic practices in religion. This would have been a direct reflection of the fact that sadism was already the order of the day in the treatment of persons captured and converted into slaves. And we see this exemplified in the Mel Gibson movie Apocalypto. Now, as for the kingdoms, in Costa Rica from the AD 800s forward, housing architecture is differentiated by class. Working people were maintained in poverty-stricken villages and used to labor in irrigation, sowing, and harvesting. Other persons lived in special urban barrios assigned by profession. In these locales, kulaks called caciques enforced the social order that required the obedience of the immense workforces. I use the term kulak here on purpose because I want you to remember our lectures on Russian history. After the Tsar abolished serfdom as such, he created a new system where the wealthiest families were used as fists, which the Russian word for fist is kulak, to enforce, by use of their own thugs, the social order in the countryside. And so we have the exact same thing happening here in the kingdoms. There was a notable peak in the art of goldsmithing throughout the country, reflecting the emergence of a gold-based de facto monetary system. In addition, there was an increase in the variety of domestic and personal goods, regional trade, alliances, and inevitably territorial conflicts. With the advent of the ATCs, Mesoamerican cultural groups simultaneously began to move into the Nicoya Peninsula. Among them were the Chorotega people, who subordinated, displaced, or mixed with populations that previously had settled in the Nicoyan territory. These new peoples introduced the Olmec religion with its burial rites and art, and they probably carried in the idea of domesticated turkeys, as these remains now appear archaeologically. The transition period features urban sites located in coastal valleys such as Nacostacolo, Papagayo, and the flood plains of rivers. In addition, there were places that specialized in salt extraction, which is always a precious trading commodity in tropical lowlands, especially for the groups living inland. Skill and multicolored ceramic art reached an advanced level, new colors and styles becoming available to local ceramic artisans. As ranks became classes and kingdoms emerged in the heart of Costa Rica, populations became more concentrated. The most well-known archaeological site of this kind is Guayaba in Turrialba, which contains raised mounds with walls of stone, access ramps, and pedestals, as well as aqueducts, elevated platforms, circular and rectangular foundations, paved walkways, and other similar structures. Other kingdoms have been found in the Central Valley, the Caribbean region, and the Northern Plains. Monumental stonework using volcanic rocks expanded and now is used to make tables, stone tablets, grinding stones, and anthropomorphic figures, especially women, heads, shamans, and warriors. In the South Pacific region, kingdoms' remains are being excavated that feature home foundations, roads, dump sites, funeral areas, and funerary mounds. Now, these kingdom urban centers were located in very fertile regions, bringing about the extensive cultivation of corn and cotton, and the use of palm trees, cayoles, and royal palms, and fruit trees such as guapinoles and nuances. This was the height of sphere making as well as stone artisanship showing animal figures. Large anthropomorphic statues of important social figures are well made and finished with smooth surfaces. And again, monetary use of gold is reflected in an increasing amount of goldsmithing with guanine, which is low-grade gold, and tubaga, which is a gold and copper alloy. Artisan specialists used hammering to create thin sheets. Mining is still to be proven, but we know that gold was taken from rivers and copper from outcrops. About this time we have the arrival of the Spanish Ronin. Now, as I say, the name Rich Coast, or Costa Rica, was given to this land by Christopher Columbus when he sailed to the eastern shores of Costa Rica during his final voyage in 1502. In his journal, he reported that the natives had vast quantities of gold jewelry. Well, this simple report was enough to attract the gold-hungry Spanish Ronin from Castile, the first of which came 20 years later, Captain Gonzalez Davila. Gil Gonzalez Davila was his name, and he landed on Costa Rica's west coast in 1522, where he did the usual, which was to capture and torture the natives, steal their gold, and in the process he established the colony we know as Panama. Now, much later, Costa Rica was the southernmost province of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, which was nominally part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, but which in practice operated as a largely autonomous entity within the Spanish Empire. Mainly, this evolved because of Costa Rica's distance from the capital in Guatemala, combined with its legal prohibition under Spanish colonial law of trading with its southern neighbors in Panama, which was now a part of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. Since Costa Rica lacked easily stolen gold and silver mines, it remained a relatively poor part of the Spanish Empire, isolated and sparsely inhabited. In fact, a Spanish governor described Costa Rica in 1719 as the poorest and most miserable Spanish colony in all of America. Another important factor behind Costa Rica's poverty was the lack of significant indigenous population available for encomienda, that is, forced labor. This meant most of the Costa Rican Spanish settlers had to work on their own land, so that they rarely could establish large haciendas or plantations or latifundias. For all these reasons, Costa Rica was never a priority for the always money-hungry Spanish crown, resulting in an opportunity for Spanish settlers to develop on their own. Costa Rica achieved national independence on September 15, 1821, after the final Spanish defeat in the Mexican War of Independence, which had gone on from 1810 to 1821. The authorities in Guatemala declared the independence of all of Central America. This date is celebrated as Independence Day in Costa Rica. Costa Rica then joined the short-lived First Mexican Empire of Agustín de Iturbide. Iturbide's regime collapsed in Mexico in 1823, after which Costa Rica became a province of the new Federal Republic of Central America, RFAC. The latter lasted from 1823 to 1839. But the RFAC was never more than an Articles of Confederation in the United States sort of regime. Civil war broke out among the provinces of the RFCA and between political factions within the individual provinces. However, Costa Rica remained largely at peace except for the 1824 movement of the Costa Rican capital to San Jose from Cartago, which resulted in some localized disorder. In 1838, as the RFAC began to disintegrate, Costa Rica formally withdrew and proclaimed itself sovereign. The considerable distance and poor communication routes between Guatemala City and the Central Plateau, where most of the Costa Rican population lived by then, that is what's now the San Jose area, and still lives now, meant that the local population had little allegiance to the federal government in Guatemala. From colonial times to now, Costa Rica has avoided direct political association with the rest of Central America. Now, we're going to move on to the second part of this, so that's Costa Rica's neighborhood during the imperialist era. And beginning in the 20th century, Costa Rica has generally enjoyed greater peace and more consistent political stability compared with many of its fellow Latin American nations, and there are several reasons for that. Since the late 1800s, however, Costa Rica has experienced two significant periods of international violence within the national boundaries. In 1917 to 1919, General Federico Tinoco Granados ruled as a military dictator until he was overthrown and forced into exile. The unpopularity of Tinoco's regime led, after he was overthrown, to a considerable decline in the size, wealth, and political influence of the Costa Rican military. The second is the Civil War of the 1940s. Our concern now is with the second, as it led to the era of Jose Figueres, under which the empire strikes back against Costa Rica. Now, the first thing we want to look at is the formation of the United Fruit Company and the period of 1899 to 1970. In 1899, Mr. Keith's Tropical Trading and Transport Company sold out to its rival Boston Fruit Company. Boston Fruit had been established by Lorenzo Dow Baker, a sailor who in 1870 had brought his first bananas in from Jamaica, and by Andrew W. Preston. Now, Preston's lawyer, a man named Bradley Palmer, had devised a scheme for the solution of these participants' cash flow problems, and that involved the merger that now formed the United Fruit Company out of Mr. Keith's Tropical Trading and Transport Company and Boston Fruit. Now, Palmer became a permanent member of the executive committee and for long periods of time the director. From a business point of view, Bradley Palmer was, as he said, United Fruit. Preston brought to the partnership his plantations in the West Indies, a fleet of steamships, and his market in the U.S. Northeast. Keith brought his plantations and railroads in Central America, and his market in the U.S. South and Southeast. At its founding, United Fruit was capitalized at $11,230,000 U.S. dollars. The company at Palmer's direction proceeded to buy a share in 14 competitors, assuring them of 80% of the banana import business into the United States. That was then their main source of income. The company catapulted into financial success, and Bradley Palmer overnight became a much sought-after expert in business law, as well as a very wealthy man. He later became a consultant to U.S. presidents and an advisor to the U.S. Congress. In 1901, the government of Guatemala hired the United Fruit Company to manage the country's postal service, and by 1913, the United Fruit Company created the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company. By 1930, it had absorbed more than 20 rival firms, acquiring a capital of $215 million U.S. dollars, which was a lot of money in 1930, becoming the single largest employer in all of Central America. In 1913, a man named Sam Zemururi, nicknamed Sam the Businessman, sold his Cayamel Fruit Company to United Fruit and retired from the fruit business. However, the collapse of the capitalist world in 1929 had led to all kinds of internal problems, and Mr. Sam Zemururi now decided that he was going to have to get back into business whether he liked it or not, and so he staged a hostile takeover of United Fruit, moved the company headquarters of United Fruit to his headquarters, which was in New Orleans, and there United Fruit went on to prosper under his management until 1951, when he finally retired. So he decided to get back into business in 1933, and for almost 20 years he ran United Fruit very successfully. The United Fruit Company, UFCO, owned vast tracts of land in the Caribbean lowlands. It also dominated regional transportation networks through its International Railways, a company called International Railways of Central America, and its Great White Fleet of steamships. UFCO's policy of acquiring tax breaks and other benefits from local governments led it to building enclave economies in these regions. So they would cut out a virtual physical geographical territory and establish their own rule within it, completely independent of whatever the national governments were doing in the Central American countries. This UFCO investment was self-contained for its employees and overseas investors. The benefits of the export earnings were not shared with Costa Rica or any other host country. In 1901, the government of Guatemala hired United Fruit Company to manage their country's postal service. In 1913, the United Fruit Company created the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company, as I mentioned, and by 1930 it had absorbed all of the rival firms, 20 of them, to get its capitalization of 215 million US dollars. Well, Sam the Banana Man, that is Sam Zamuri, sold his Cayamel Fruit Company, as we've seen, and moved it to. But then he had to get back involved, and so he moved his whole operation into New Orleans, Louisiana, and ran everything from there. Well, he retired in 1951. United Fruit just went on its merry way through a group of managers, professional managers, exploiting all of Central America, and it entered a new corporate phase 17 years later in 1968. United Brands, 1968 to 1984, the Black Era. Corporate raider Eli M. Black bought 733,000 shares of United Fruit in 1968, becoming the country's largest single shareholder. In June 1970, Black merged the United Fruit Company with his own public company, AMK, which was the owner of the meatpacker John Morrell. From this acquisition, United Fruit became the United Brands Company. However, it appears that United Fruit had far less cash than Black had counted on. Black's subsequent management course centered on leveraging other buyouts, and this further crippled United Brands with debt. The company's losses were made worse by Hurricane Fifi in 1974, which destroyed many banana plantations in Honduras altogether. On February 3, 1975, Black committed suicide by jumping out of his office on the 44th floor of the Pan Am building in New York City. Well, as a result of all of this, there had to be a reorganization. The U.S. SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, now exposed a scheme by United Brands called Bananagate. The centerpiece was the bribery of Honduran President Osvaldo López Arellano with $1.25 million, plus the promise of another $1.25 million upon the reduction of certain export taxes. And the immediate results were trading with United Brands stock was temporarily frozen by the SEC, and Lopez was removed in a CIA-organized military coup. Well, Chiquita Brands International. Now this comes up when Cincinnati-based American Financial Group, one of billionaire Carl Lindner Jr.'s companies, bought into United Brands in August of '84. Lindner took control of the company and renamed it Chiquita Brands International, and then moved its headquarters to Cincinnati in 1985. Throughout most of its history, United Fruit's main competitor was the Standard Fruit Company, now the Dole Food Company, D-O-L-E. A history of bad acts by the octopus. The United Fruit Company history was that of bribing government officials in exchange for preferential treatment. This extended to exploiting its workers, paying little by way of taxes to the governments of the countries in which it operated, and working ruthlessly to consolidate its growing and shipping monopolies. Latin American journalists sometimes referred to the company as El Pulpo, the octopus. Labor organizers in Central and South America fought back, organizing strikes. Criticism of the United Fruit Company became a focus of the communist parties in all Latin American countries. United Fruit was a perfect and at-hand example of Lenin's theory of capitalist imperialism. Major left-wing writers in Latin America, such as Carlos Luis Fallas of Costa Rica, Ramon Amaya Amador of Honduras, Miguel Angel Asturias, and Augusto Monterroso of Guatemala, Gabriel Garcia Marquez of Colombia, Carmen Lira of Costa Rica, and Pablo Neruda of Chile denounced the company in their literature. In the Showtime movie Fidel, Che Guevara cites Neruda's poem about United Fruit to Fidel Castro and those assembled at dinner, which Fidel greatly appreciates. Progressive artists in the United States also frequently criticized the business practices of United Fruit. Little Steven released a song called Bitter Fruit in 1987, in which lyrics referred to a hard life for a company far away, and his accompanying video depicted orange groves worked by peasant workers overseen by wealthy managers. United Fruit, or Chiquita, was the target. The Dulles connection. John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles had written the Versailles Agreement that raped Germany. Now Dulles and his law firm Sullivan and Cromwell negotiated the land giveaways to the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and Honduras. Allen Dulles also did legal work for United Fruit and sat on its board of directors. Allen Dulles had become head of the CIA under Eisenhower, and in a flagrant conflict of interest, the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell were on the United Fruit payroll for 38 years. A man named Rich Cohen wrote a book in 2012, just 3 years ago, called The Fish That Ate the Whale. And there's a funny part of it I think that's worth citing. He says, quote, John Foster Dulles, who represented United Fruit while he was a law partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, negotiated that crucial United Front deal with Guatemalan officials in the 1930s and was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. His brother Allen did legal work for the United Fruit Company and sat on its board of directors while being head of the CIA under Eisenhower. Henry Cabot Lodge, then the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was a large owner of United Fruit stock. Ed Whitman, the United Fruit PR man, was married to Ann Whitman, Dwight Eisenhower's personal secretary. You could not see these connections until you could, and then you could not stop seeing them, unquote. That's from the book The Fish That Ate the Whale, published in 2012 by Rich Cohen. And I'm going to have to stop this tape now because we've run out of time, and we'll have to continue this in a second part.